Welcome to Dive into World Building. We have the bummer of all topics now, a very serious topic to discuss today, uh, death and funerals. Well, so coming into this, I'm thinking back to this discussion that we have had, because we have discussed death and funerals on the show before, but it was back in the days before we could actually record it for YouTube. So it means that effectively what we discussed at that time vanished. um, but this is actually something really important, and I think it's worth talking about because death practices across the world and the way that death is viewed culturally varies quite a bit, and it has changed over time in some really interesting ways. And so I figured that it was worth diving in because, if you're going to go out there and you're going to read a story like Harry Markov's The Language of Knives, that's all about death practices, right? And it's a fascinating story, so you can totally go to interesting places with this topic. And I'm going to use Harry's story on Tor.com as a total example that this can be super interesting and send you in some really amazing directions. But let's see. I think I want to start with something that was brought to my attention a while ago, but I thought it was fascinating, and that is the way that that germ theory changed our view of death. Because in a way, before germ theory came about, illnesses were seen as something that just kind of happened to you, right? Mm-hmm. And if it then led to death, death was similarly something that just kind of happened to you. And there was a sort of certainly there was more of a sense of it as part of life, I guess. It was something that, I don't imagine it was welcome, but it happened so much more often. I mean, so there was the frequency of people dying, pre-antibiotics and all kinds of things like that. But there was also this sense that death sort of just happened. And post-germ theory, what you get is this sense that really you're fighting something, and that death is something that, I mean, it's interesting because really you're not fighting so much the death as you're fighting the disease, but in a way death becomes the surrender in that battle, right?
Or failure.
Or a failure, right? And I think that has really drastically changed the way that we handle death, because it seems that view definitely contributes to the way that we talk metaphorically about people who are sick. We talk about people fighting for life, and we talk about, their great battle and their courage and this, that, and the other, and all of a sudden it's a war, and death is the defeat, right? And I think that mindset contributes to the amount of money that is spent trying to keep people from dying right at the end of their lives, even when the battle becomes too painful and too horrible for people to endure.
And possibly why people who want to end their own lives because the battle is just obviously going to be lost and it's too painful are treated as, seen as quitters,
mm-hmm.
and failures because they won't
fight
until it's over.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it was, and I think it was in a sense, this realization that we could fight certain types of diseases that that by association put death into this category where we could fight it. So, um, so I thought that was something that would be important to
Yeah.
mention.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
If you read historical literature, uh, then especially things like, okay, so I remember the death that occurred in Little Women.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling really sad about it, but I don't remember it feeling like it was some, gigantic battle. It was more like, and then my sister sort of started fading away, and then, one day she was gone, right? If you look at, like, even further back, the tale of Genji, when Murasaki Shikibu talks about people dying in the imperial court of Japan, it's almost like, well, and then this person took sick and died, right? you know, One day they were there, and next day they weren't there anymore, and and while that has a lot of repercussions for what's going on in the world, it the way that it's treated is so kind of like, well, and then this happened, and you have to figure that this was so normal, right? Because things can hit you out of nowhere.
People didn't live as long either.
Precisely.
If you're topping out at 50,
yeah.
Then it's not, then like, if you do make it past then you're like, wow,
Yeah.
It's like, they made it to 80, no way. It's like a big deal.
The high rate of child and infant mortality.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, you'll hear on a news story or something, oh, it's not right for a parent to have to bury their child.
Yeah,
well,
but it was the most common thing.
Every parent buried one or more children.
Oh, God, you'd lose at least half.
My mother was born in 1910, and they didn't think she was going to live, so they didn't give her a name. And it was 6 months. She was 6 months old before they were like, "Oh, well, yeah, I guess she's going to live. Let's name her."
Yeah,
a number of cultures that don't do that, or historically, because they don't know. If your kid isn't going to live, you don't name your child routinely, culturally. If you name your baby before it's 3 weeks or 3 months or whatever, it's going to anger somebody, and the baby will die. So just don't do it. So there are cultures that take that into account as their rituals and their
yeah.
That was coherent.
No. I think you're right. So absolutely.
It pops up in the in some of the Grimm's fairy tales, some of the less well-known ones, where you run into hero characters who are named things like nothing or no man or no boy. They weren't given a name, and then the parent passed away before they could give them a name. And so they went through life with the equivalent of John Doe.
Interesting.
Name them, and a couple of them, it's the call to adventure. It's this child is born before they're a year old and are given their name. The parent that's there with them dies, so when they grow up, they have to go on a quest to find the other parent. um, to, to get a name, basically, or to find out what their name is.
Huh.
So it pop up that possibility, that you might, that if you're one of the lucky ones, that nobody thought would survive, or you're one of the lucky ones who survived past, your naming day, or the point at which you might be given a name, because everyone's decided that you're going to be one of the survivors. There's always the chance the parent's going to go instead. That there's, that it wasn't,
Yeah.
it just wasn't very sure.
Wow, that's interesting.
So, what do people do? In various cultures, you have a child or an adult who's died, and there are a number of ways to dispose of the body, and so you'd have different rituals. I was also realizing that what you do with the body depends on your environment, or can depend on your environment. You have above ground.
I didn't hear that.
What you do with the body would depend on the environment. If you live in New Orleans, and we'll have mausoleums above ground, because you don't bury coffins in basically underwater.
The water table's too high, yeah. They'll just wash up later.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to bury a bubble in water. And then eventually your coffins start popping up out of the ground.
Yeah.
No wonder they've got all those stories about the dead coming back,
But a mausoleum can also be a way to keep families together and show off the money that you have to provide for these houses. But I guess there are also funeral pyres, shipped downriver, or just not shipped downriver.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different ways.
Well, and the amount
There are pyres. There's cremation in a special location.
Sky burial. I always like that one.
Sky burial?
The Tibetan, they cut you up and feed you to, like, condors, but not condors. Tibetan equivalent of condors.
Wow.
Put
They
the
feed
body
you to, like,
up on
scavenger, because there's no, it's all rock.
Right.
You can't, I mean, unless you're going to chip a cave out of a mountainside.
Which
I don't know how, like, super common that is, but there's that one.
Yeah.
You also have, I guess, funeral cairns. Where you can't bury too deeply, so you put rocks on it.
Yep.
And then that becomes not just a please don't dig up my relative and munch on his body.
Keeps the coyotes
also
off.
but also a marker.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and you've got coffins. And then in cases where you can't do coffins, you just have the burial with a little marker if you can.
Well, and there's also the bury the body for 1 year and then dig the bones back up and clean them and put them in a smaller container.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was China, huh? I heard about that. It's like you kind of just keep them in, like, a jar. There's, like, jars with, like, their name on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure where, but
yeah.
I think so. I think that's. But yeah, I don't know.
And they have cremation, but then the parts of the bones that aren't burnt are pulled out of the ashes with giant chopsticks, and I believe kept.
You also have.
And that's the. Sorry, Kimberly, I can barely hear you.
Oh, Sorry, I was thinking you also have the cities of the dead under like Vatican City, right, where they've
Right, right.
where
Yeah.
you're interred in a wall alcove for a period of time, and then the bones are removed to make way for the next set of relatives that goes in there, and then you end up with these amazing, the people who'd go down there and clean the bones and move the bones around built these amazing structures underground entirely out of human bones, right? It's sort of the advanced form of the reliquary, and
Yeah.
all underground.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's scattering ashes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. In rituals or in personal personal desires. Let's take Dad's ashes and scatter them off this mountainside because that's where he really loved to hang out.
I feel
Yeah.
like that's a fairly modern
Yeah.
practice. So it's like that new thing where they plant you in like that capsule and like a tree grows out.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's brand new too.
Yeah. That's very recent.
There was a group that would shoot some of your ashes into space.
You can still get that done. Gene
Can
Roddenberry
still work?
is
Yep.
up there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. Let's see.
There's one about making a jewel out of your ashes.
Yes.
Wow.
Jewel.
Like what kind of jewel? Like an actual precious gem?
A diamond.
Like
Yeah,
a
diamond.
Yeah, like
Nice.
compressing your ashes into.
Sweet. I'm sorry.
And there is a group in Texas that will mummify you in the traditional Egyptian fashion.
Okay.
Which makes for an interesting coffee table, I guess.
I don't know. Like, what would you do with yourself after that, though?
But then you need the sarcophagus, which is basically a coffin.
Somebody's going to
They
have to
apparently
keep you.
Apparently they have different price points. So they begin with the mummification, and then it's a sliding scale from there as to how far your finances can afford to take the entire process. So
Can you get a pyramid?
in the United States you can get anything.
With enough money, yeah.
But I do know they at one point they were providing a full sarcophagus, but then you're looking at $200,000 or something for the full regalia, if you will. But
I could
So
buy my
you
whole
guys
house for that.
seen those pictures from the Victorian era? Portraits of the family where somebody is dead.
Yeah.
Oh, those.
Yeah, the memento.
I've got one of those, yes.
Wow.
Well, it was like a new technology, and it was a way to keep them.
Oh, yeah.
It was the first time you could have photographs, because otherwise, if you couldn't afford to have a portrait or a miniature painted, you just had to go from memory. And then photography became cheap and easy, and everyone could have portraits of, like, when they're dead, they could just arrange them and take a picture, and then you've got that, like, for perpetuity.
Yeah.
I wonder. See, now the last photo I have of my grandmother, I think, is from some years before she died, and that's partly because, well, I won't say scattered, but the getting together the 4 generations of women takes some time and involves some distance. So, but if you pull everybody together after death, for the funeral or whatever, then just before, then you've got the person right there, the body right there, and you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But
people lived closer together.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it's like, you wouldn't necessarily even leave the village you were born in, so
Yeah.
it wasn't hard to get the family together when so-and-so died. They're like, let's go get a picture.
Well,
Sometimes
funerals do gather people together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes people who maybe shouldn't be.
Well,
it
sometimes,
is, you
but
know.
on the other hand, sometimes what it does is it provides an opportunity for the people who are mourning to reestablish their connections with one another in a vulnerable time.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I have found actually very valuable about funeral gatherings, is that there's a lot of sadness, obviously, but it's not all sadness. There's a lot of mutual support and talking about old times and just sort of reestablishing a lot of the social connections.
Yeah. It can go either way. Well, it can go different ways for different people who are there. If the deceased has done something just plain unforgivable that nobody but the person who's suffered this really understands, and they're being told, get over it, the person's dead, forgive them, and you can't. There's been a lifetime of abuse, and it's apparent, you have to show up. You kind of have to show up, but playing the hiding and playing the sure, yeah, I forgive this lifetime of abuse. But yeah, there can also be the we've been separated for decades over some squabble that made sense at the time, but doesn't anymore. So we are going to get over it. And if there's blame involved, that can be another thing. If you're blaming someone else who's there for the death, then that's you both have to be there, but there may be some animosity involved. Oh, that's something I just realized about the story that prompted me to ask for this topic. Oh yeah, that's gonna go well. Yeah, that's gonna go well. But the funeral. Well, the guy is already saying, it's your fault. So, at the funeral in front of people, yeah, that could be bad.
Wow.
So, what do the funerals look like? The part before the burials. Families turn up.
Actually, I think that depends, though, because I'm not sure that's an automatic. The family shows up. Maybe I don't know.
Well, so I'm going to recommend a movie to you.
Potter's Grave.
It's called The Funeral.
Uh-huh.
It's a comedy from Japan. And effectively, it's a story about this Japanese family who has to get together for a Buddhist funeral after this old guy has died. But the first scene of the film is how awful he is to his wife. And after seeing him be really awful, then when he falls over dead, you're a little bit like, oh, don't know how to feel about that. And then the whole thing is focused on how everybody has to come together and play these socially circumscribed roles and enact this mourning when not everybody's really missing the guy, and the main characters are actually actors. They act in advertising. Very meta. So the actors are playing actors who act in advertising, and so they're actually at certain points they end up rehearsing their mourning. Like, so what do we do when everybody's around? Oh, well, oh gosh, this speech that I'm supposed to be able to give is so long. How about I just do Overcome by Grief? But I mean, in terms of, yes, it's a comedy. I have a hard time laughing at it, honestly. But in terms of just looking at the social obligations and the complexity of the interactions and all this kind of stuff that goes on in this the funeral that's being depicted, and there are ceremonies over several days in the, I believe, the Buddhist tradition requires a um, certain number of ceremonies at particular intervals after the death. But anyway, fascinating if you want to get, yeah, it's definitely not for children. But it is fascinating in the way that it looks into all those kinds of social obligations and the possible problems that arise when the person who died isn't necessarily a good person.
Yeah.
So worth recommending. And Che, what were you recommending? Departures?
Yeah. It's this guy and his wife. He actually it kind of from the other end. He's a cellist, and his mother dies, and he goes back home to like Hokkaido with his wife, and ends up looking for a job. And the only thing he can find is like assistant at a funeral home. But it's not a funeral home the way it's a US funeral home. They go and they prepare the bodies and they do the thing and they got the coffin with the window, and everything. And it's sort of him coming to terms with that as a job, and that as like sort of like it's not like a really well respected because you're kind of dirty if you handle the dead.
Yeah.
So he has to kind of deal with that prejudice, but then also sort of finds like this nobility in it. And at the end, like his father had left him as a child, like with his mother, just abandoned them. And he finds his father again, and his father dies, and he has to do the whole ritual for his father at the end. It's really good. It's really, really good.
Sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
There's the.
But there's like this sort of keeping evil spirits away when someone's died is very often a thing.
There's in Judaism. There's the Hever Kadisha, which is the people who go through the preparation of the body, and I don't remember all the details, but it is a thing that is a ritual, involves rituals for preparing the body for burial. Very respectful of the person, and I know the body, I suppose. I really should read up on that more.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. But, I'm thinking also there's another culture that I've heard about where when somebody dies, I'm trying to remember what culture this is, so tell me if it rings a bell to you. When somebody dies, they actually sit them up like on a shelf and decorate them and decorate the whole shelf around them and sort of make them almost into a ceremonial mummy for a period of time.
I want to say that sounds like South America, but
doesn't it? I think I read about it in my Spanish class.
Because they do have like the Inca, they've found lots and lots of Incan mummies and things where people were mummified and decorated and put in caves and things.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, caves. I forgot about caves in terms of places to stash bodies, as it were.
Yeah.
Inter. Thank you. That's that is the real word.
Well, and mummies and mummification in particular are interesting because in some cases it's done environmentally, like in Peru and South America, the weather conditions are what create the mummies. But then you have late period Egypt where mummification was a deliberate act, whereas really early Egypt it was environmental. The environment sort of tends to mummify the bodies, and then you have in China and to a lesser extent in like Korea, you have monks who essentially self-mummify themselves at the end of
Mm-hmm.
their lives, and they consume broths of preservation agents, and at the end of the entire process they have essentially passed on and mummified themselves, by all accounts very quietly, and they are regarded as being in the ultimate state of meditation, and that they could still potentially wake up at some future time.
Hmm.
And so it's a very interesting, sort of transcendence, but it throws it. Mummies seem to always be revered, right? It's not that mummies don't tend to get. I mean, they were put away for protective reasons in part in Middle Egypt, but they still tend to be put away with a lot of fanfare, and there's a whole there's mythology that goes with disturbing mummies,
Yeah.
which is very different than the mythology that you might find from burials, right? Or from burying somebody in the ground without all of the ceremony that goes along with mummifying the body. So it's kind of an interesting difference between the way these natural or created mummies are treated versus the way that I would say a more Western burial is treated, where the bodies are being preserved underground for the end of days or for whatever comes next.
Yeah.
So the rituals, I mean, there's the sitting the body up and having it sort of sit in state, or lying in state, those keeping the body, I guess, sort of not just the day before the funeral or 2 days
No,
before the funeral,
if it's
but
like, especially like heads of state,
Yeah.
yes,
that's when, and so like the whole populace, whoever can get there, can go and shuffle through and view, like Lenin or Lincoln, um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
were in state sort of for a while after death.
Now,
Yeah.
did people actually take souvenirs? Because I mean, back in the day,
Yeah.
you've got the way that people like to collect relics of certain
Yeah.
saints and stuff. And I'm wondering if that was something that happened post burial, or whether it was something that happened while the body was lying in state. I don't know the answer to that question, but it would be something to think about or
Yeah.
research.
Historically, it's been, the people who prepare the body and then who bury the body tended to loot the body.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sort of seems. I mean, if you look at, I'm looking at Victorian era
Oh
records
God,
for
yes.
this kind of thing, where that was part of how they got paid in Victorian times, is that they would take the body and prepare it, and then, because nobody wanted to deal with the body, especially if they died of sickness or disease.
Right.
So they would they would sell the clothes, they would sell the rings. If the family didn't put up the money for the burial, then that was how you got paid, is you looted the
Right.
body before you put it in the ground.
Well, and
Well,
even when they did
actually, that's.
pay,
I'm thinking of there is a description in Dickens' A Christmas Carol of the people who are taking care of Scrooge's body and how they're selling off his bed curtains and and his clothes. And,
Yeah, exactly. All those pieces, were fair game. And then if you were lucky, if you didn't have a family that would pay for it, then your body could be sold to the medical students, right?
underground.
Particularly Victorian era, but once you were, which is kind of an odd disconnect when you think about the religiousness of that particular area of Western culture versus the body's, there's nobody left in the body, let's sell it off and hack it up for experiments, right? Versus we want to
Like
preserve
sort of
it,
the new age of
perfectly,
science.
so that when the end of the world comes, everybody can rise from their graves and resume living. So
Yeah.
kind of a
But I was
weird.
also, with the looting of the body, I was also thinking of the coppers on the eyes, and put pennies on the
yeah.
eyes,
Okay.
to pay the ferryman, um, because you're not gonna get
Or
across that
another
river.
place that we make money sometimes is on the tongue.
Oh, okay.
On the
That,
tongue or
No.
under
I
the
think
tongue.
that was more like, I think the Greek
Yeah.
did that, so you'd have it with you, so you couldn't lose it, like, but, yeah, but I don't know if they kind of like, if the Victorians kind of like resurrected it,
Probably. They
or
were
borrowed it.
very. Yeah, there was that period of time where they were just borrowing everything from what they imagined Hellenic culture was like.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there was a period.
I
Yeah.
wonder if anybody, said, okay, I know that the people burying this body are going to loot it, so this is what I'm going to put on the body for their self-payment there.
I don't think
But you
so.
That
probably
would be a
there would
personal
probably be a taboo
decision.
about talking about it that way.
Sorry?
You wouldn't necessarily talk about it that way. You're not going to say,
No.
"Well, I'm going to put this money on the body so that it goes on the body."
It would be a very personal,
Well, you'd end up with a
private thing.
euphemism, though, right? You'd put something extra in the pocket for the ferryman, or you know what I mean. You'd end up with a cultural euphemism for this is my uncle. Don't hack his fingers off and sell them to Dr. Frankenstein. Kind of
Yeah.
niceties, if you will.
Well, I think it was also like who you could get that was like reliable to bury your relatives.
Yeah.
I'm sure you had to fork over to find someone who wasn't going to loot it. Otherwise, you just took your chances.
Yeah. So, boy, this is so fascinating.
It is. It is.
Um,
And we haven't got to the feasts or the what do you wear to the funeral or what words are said over the body or the
well, exactly, and we've
the
also the
eulogies
other
and
thing we haven't covered is whether people are expected to take anything with them,
right.
like the terracotta warriors in China, or all of the different stuff that would be buried with the mummies in Egypt.
Yeah.
Mm.
Or even, the Bronze Age burials with swords and
Yeah.
Well, they found grave goods going back to
Great goods.
earliest man.
yeah.
When you'd be buried with flowers and beads or whatever,
Yeah.
So it's sort of always been a thing. But it's like the grandness of the thing depended on your status. So
Yeah.
an emperor could have a terracotta army,
Yeah.
and the Egyptians could have, their, slaves and boats and cattle and cats and crocodiles and gold and take it all with them. But like the average person on the street is just gonna, maybe you get like a couple of clay horses or something,
That somebody made for you out of dirt. Well,
right,
and-
well-
so if you're lucky, if they liked you enough, they'll send you with some stuff.
A few decades ago, there was a woman here locally who was buried in her car.
Nice.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
but that's Texas, right?
Yeah.
So if you
I bet it was a Cadillac too.
I probably was. I can't remember, but I think it was like a
Wow.
Cadillac convertible or something.
so maybe
wasn't
weapons.
Wasn't there someplace where if a husband died, his wife would be buried alive with him?
Yeah,
That
there are horrible
happens
places.
a lot.
Sati,
There's
where
some
the
stuff
husband was on the funeral pyre and the wife
Mm,
expected to throw herself on top.
Uh-huh.
that's
If
yeah.
not, the in-laws will throw her in for him.
Yeah,
Horrible,
I think I
horrible
like
thing.
the other choices. Weapons and tools. You bury your sword or your shield, and then there's the luxuries that we're talking about.
Mhm.
Food for the journey. And then I haven't heard about this, but I was thinking if you were to lose a small child, not an infant, but a toddler or a little older, a favorite toy, you know,
That's
which
true. They
you
have.
might
Yeah.
keep as a reminiscence, as a
Actually, I've
or
heard of
bury
them
with the
being
kid.
buried with their toys, being buried
Yeah.
with toys.
Yeah, that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what's the purpose of burying that?
It's so it goes with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so that they have it in the afterlife.
Yeah. So for them to have. So
Yeah,
some
and
funeral
so
rituals.
like, what are you gonna do with it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Look at it and cry.
yeah, exactly. So they might as well take it with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially with a child, you know, the child is not alone. He's got his favorite teddy bear, so he won't be scared.
Yeah.
You know,
when
in
it happens.
Japan, they have a special area of the temple, a special area of the cemetery, and I encourage you to Google image Japanese cemeteries because they look very different from our cemeteries in
I've
some
seen a
really
lot of
interesting
anime.
ways. But there also in temples there are these special areas dedicated to infants and unborn children who have died. And generally, what they'll do is they'll set up a little statue of Jizo, who is the protector of children, and then put like a little red bib on it, and then they will bring offerings to the statue in honor of the child who has died.
Yeah, that's another thing I think is interesting, and I would like to steal someday. Or not supposed to say that. It's like sort of having like this sort of altar to your family with like
Mm.
like in Rome, they would have, your whole family, you'd have like their the death masks of your ancestors set
Yeah.
up.
Right.
In China and Japan, you get like a whole altar, with like photographs, because I don't know what they did probably before photographs would probably be like nameplates or something, or,
Possibly
and then people,
calligraphy or possibly like a painting or something, depending on
yeah.
whether there was one available.
Yeah, yeah, and then like, people, because it does have some corollary in the West, because there are like, people who like put out that plate for the dead relative, or have their
Mhm.
parents' ashes on their mantle, um, but having it be like this formal thing, I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Like a formal area in your house for that.
Yeah. It's interesting. Um. Oh, what was I just thinking of? Oh well.
So what sort of because you have so much knowledge about Japan, what kind of ceremonies and prayers and rituals would be at the funeral? Because a lot of times the funeral is for the living, to see
Right.
them off.
I don't know a ton about this, so I encourage people who are curious to go and do more research. But from what I've seen, the Buddhist rituals involve chanting of texts,
Sutras, maybe?
sutras, yeah, chanting of sutras, and a lot of kneeling in circles, listening to the priest chant, that kind of thing. But that said, that is a very, very, very limited view from just what I've encountered, because I actually have not gone to a funeral in
Right.
Japan. So I don't know. I've walked past them, so you can always tell when there's a funeral, because what they'll do is they'll decorate the outside of the home with a white shrine curtain or a temple curtain kind of thing with black designs on it. And so, I mean, that's obviously something that's quite fascinating. You walk by and you automatically know that there's something going on, and that sad, right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, we could seriously. We're now 5 minutes to 4, and we could go on all day.
Oh my god, I
could.
know.
We could.
You know, what is the color of death?
Yeah.
Oh.
Right?
No. Yeah.
The color of death is not always the same. So I believe in China it's white.
I've
Yes,
heard that
I
too,
believe.
although I'm not sure like that it's like quite so much in the modern. I think like as things have changed and cultures, you know, everybody's borrowing everything from everyone.
Right.
Well, if you go back to MASH, and Klinger was going to marry a local woman, and so he got her this beautiful white wedding dress, and she burst into tears.
No.
So he just went with the locals, knowing what they were doing, and they found her beautiful red dress. It was actually a red dress and not a burial gown. So yeah, white would be. You wonder why though? Where do the colors come from?
I know. Why is it black in the West?
Colors at one point.
Yeah.
That stuff just changes over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in Varan world, the color of death is the color of the moon, because the moon is the goddess who takes your soul up into the sky if you've been good. And so everybody has a mourning scarf that's this sort of moon color of yellow, which is the mourning color. You know, so anything that we've talked about in this hangout can be extrapolated or, you know, made into an alternative scenario in a secondary world.
Yeah.
Right?
I watched that HBO series Rome, and there's an edition of the DVDs which I highly recommend watching. It's not an edition; it's just an alternate. What you can do is you turn on. It's basically like VH1's pop-up video, but it's like the whole series. You can watch it up, and like facts about Rome pop up as things happen, and it's just riveting. And one of the things was when Caesar's funeral, it was they talked about the Roman funerary rites for like the whole course of the funeral. And one of the things was that the women who traditionally wore veils, you know, over their head, would take them off, would go bareheaded, and the men would wear a veil for mourning. So it was like they would sort of swap attire, sort of, just to be different for that. Well,
and you know, I mean,
that it was
we could spend a whole. we may need to come back to this because, I mean, we haven't even touched on the etiquette surrounding dress and stuff at funerals. We haven't really touched on. Going into mourning and what that means.
Yeah.
Wakes, food.
You know, the idea that so for example, you find in Shakespeare in Twelfth Night that that the heroine has gone into mourning and is keeping her mourning for a really long time because it keeps men away from her. You know, I mean, it's so fascinating what you can do with some of this stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, and like the whole Victorian mourning and half mourning and
yeah.
But I remember like Scarlett O'Hara, who like couldn't get out of mourning fast enough after the first sort of irrelevant guy she married, and she was dying to go dancing, but had to like stand there in black and not dance. And she's just like dying on the inside because she has to do this whole stupid mourning thing for some guy she didn't even love anyway.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I will actually, let me say, Ancillary Sword by Anne Leckie has a really interesting death practice in it. That if you haven't read it, you should go check this out. Somebody dies on the space station, and the people who were immediately present at the death are, you know, are required to go into mourning if there's no family or something like this. But anyway, I would have to look it up for the specifics, but it was really interesting because the main character ends up being in mourning for somebody that she barely knew. And therefore she has to change all of her behavior and circumscribe what she's allowed to do and stuff like this. It was fascinating. Really fascinating. So
Yeah.
there's so much potential to this topic. I feel like we're only barely getting started.
I know. I know.
So,
And what does the future hold?
Exactly.
How is technology changing it all? Are we all just going to be uploaded one day? We're never going to die.
Let's come
that
back
too.
What I'll do is I'll write down that we need to come back to this and we need to talk about funerals more, dress and manners, and we need to talk about mourning more, but also about afterlife concepts and stuff like that. And we'll come back to the topic sometime in the future because I think this is worth another hour.
Great.
I mean,
yeah.
it's odd because it's kind of hard as a topic to get into and kind of go, yes, I'm going to talk about this. Once you open it up, it's just like the richness of it is just incredible.
Oh yeah, just the intersection of afterlife concept and burial practice.
Yes.
Is right there. There's a huge topic.
Yeah.
Yep. So let's come back to that another time. Do you want to do it next week? Do we want to do it next week? I don't have a topic for next week yet, so
We never got to humor ever. Like, we never got to humor. It was canceled twice.
I know. I'm
That's
feeling
true.
like it's me. I'm anxious. I'm anxious at the prospect of doing humor because every time I try to schedule it, something awful happens.
That's a good point.
Third time's a charm?
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know.
Let's do humor. Let's do humor next week. That sounds
Maybe.
good.
Sort of. If you feel like it's going to be canceled, switch it to funerals again.
Yes. Yeah, I was thinking that.
Yeah. So let's try humor for next week, and we have another guest coming. Silvia Moreno Garcia is going to be here on June the 10th, which should be really, really fun. And she's got a novel out, and she's got some really interesting things that she's doing. So it'll be fun to hear about that. That will be on the 10th. So let's try humor for next week to kind of lighten up the mood a little bit. But I did write down my notes for continuing the death topic on another occasion.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop the broadcast.